A quiet town is racked with terror as police hunt a killer who preys on young women. A vague description and inadequate clues are all they have. The next move is up to him. Someone took great pains to try to dispose of a body. Stripped of her identity, this victim can't lead detectives to her killer. Any chance of justice must be found in the dead woman's hands. A dark night, a sharp curve, and a woman lies dead at the bottom of a canyon. It looks like an accident, but maybe that was the plan. Most people don't kill unless they're certain they can get away with it. Murderers always believe they can outwit the police. And that's their fatal error. In the late night hours on Tuesday, November 23, 1982, police in Morris County, New Jersey were visited by the mother and co-worker of 18-year-old Amy Hoffman. Amy had failed to return from her job at a nearby mall. Amy's mother told police that her daughter worked at the dress store 2 nights a week. She was on her high school cheerleading team and was saving to go to college to become a chiropractor. Amy's co-worker said that Amy helped her lock up. It was around 9:30, and they were among the last at the mall. When Amy failed to return home, her mother went to the mall to look for her. Her car was the only one in the lot. Her keys were in the ignition. Amy's book bag, purse, and wallet were all on the seat. But there was no sign of her daughter. Frantic, Mrs. Hoffman called Amy's co-worker. The two didn't know where else to turn. Police responded to the mall parking lot with a canine handler to track Amy. Her scent trail went cold 2 parking spaces away. Evidently, she left the mall with someone else. But who? The parking lot yielded no clues. According to Morris County Detective Sergeant John Kennecom, neither did Amy's car.
We searched the vehicle as we do routinely for fingerprints, any type of items which may assist us in the missing person, but we ultimately didn't find anything.
But that was about to change. 2 days later, on Thanksgiving Day, a man out for an afternoon walk in a secluded area of Morris County, New Jersey, made a startling discovery. The lifeless body of a young woman. He fled the scene and called police. Responding deputies from the Morris County Sheriff's Department found the victim lying in an abandoned water retention tank. From the description, police knew they had found Amy Hoffman. She had suffered multiple stab wounds. The body was removed and sent off for further analysis. Investigators began scouring the area for clues, looking for anything that might help them identify Amy's killer. Bloodstains were recovered near the tank, but later tests showed they belonged to the victim. Evidence technicians gathered all that they could. Sometimes the most valuable clues masquerade as ordinary litter. The autopsy had a little more information to offer. The victim had been stabbed repeatedly and had most likely bled to death. There were indications that she'd also been sexually assaulted, but no biological evidence was found. Fibers and bits of foam padding clinging to her boots and clothing were the only potential evidence collected. Hoping for more information, police returned to the mall to question other employees.
I need to ask you some questions.
One woman stated that when she left the mall around 9 p.m., she saw a creepy-looking man just sitting there in his car. She thought the vehicle was an old Chevy. She only caught a glimpse of the man's face. She could not offer police a detailed description. Investigators knew they would have to work quickly.
We knew we had a major offender in our community. We knew we had somebody that was a predator. And what motivated me, as well as all the other law enforcement officers who worked in this case, is we had to capture this guy before he killed again.
But 2 weeks after Amy Hoffman was murdered, a truck driver parked at a rest stop 20 minutes from the Morris County Mall was jolted from his sleep. A terrified young woman was begging for help. She was bleeding badly and barely clinging to life. The truck driver called police. Though she'd lost a lot of blood, 25-year-old Deirdre O'Brien was still conscious when the paramedics came. She told authorities that less than 1 mile from her home, a car forced her off the road. Fearing the driver of the other vehicle had been hurt in the accident, she went to see if he was okay. He brandished a knife and forced her into his car, an old Chevy. He drove her to the rest stop, sexually assaulted her, and then stabbed her repeatedly. Deirdre O'Brien would not survive her injuries. She died at the hospital, but not before giving a description of her killer.
The victim of the second homicide advised law enforcement officers that the assailant was in fact a white male. He was about the same size as the victim, that he had blue jeans on and a certain type of shirt. It was a Western type shirt.
The suspect and his vehicle matched the description of the suspect in the Amy Hoffman case. With only tiny synthetic fibers recovered from Deirdre O'Brien's clothing, investigators went to the site where she had been abducted to search for more clues. They found a tire track left in the dirt. It was photographed, and then a cast was carefully made. To preserve the impression, forensic investigators use a durable casting medium called dental stone, originally formulated for making dental casts. It sets up quickly and is more durable than traditional plaster. While the tread was only one potential clue, it was the strongest.
Most energy was put onto the tire track itself, because we could see where its location, approximately 4 feet from the victim's vehicle, that it was probably the suspect's tire.
The cast and photographs of the tread were sent to forensic tire expert Pete McDonald.
And I looked at the tread design guide book and found that there were maybe 20 different imprints similar. However, the Cyberling Snow Power tire looked the most consistent.
Detective Sergeant Kennecom carried the photo of the tread impression to shopping malls, neighborhoods, and junkyards. But he couldn't find a single tire like the one Pete McDonald described. Investigators were driven to find the killer before the killer found victim number 3.
Where it occurred?
But then a call came in. There'd been another stabbing. Investigators in Morris County, New Jersey struggled to solve the homicides of 2 young women. All of the clues pointed to a serial killer, but none pointed to a suspect. As investigators raced to identify a suspect before he could strike again, another stabbing was reported. This time, the victim was a man, but the details were familiar. 34-year-old James Kodadich told police that while he was driving, he was pulled over by an early model Chevy with a flashing blue light on the dash. The driver of the other car pulled him out of his vehicle and stabbed him. Kodadich fought off his attacker and fled to his mother's house. His description of the assailant resembled the murderer at large. To police, James Kodadich was fortunate. His wounds were not serious. An ambulance came to take him to the hospital. Before leaving, he gave the police permission to examine his car for any trace evidence his attacker might have left. Hoping to find evidence linking this incident to the unsolved murders, examiners thoroughly vacuumed the car. It was an early model Chevy, the same type as described by witnesses of the previous 2 murders. Thinking it may just be a strange coincidence, Detective Kennecom took a closer look at the tires.
I looked at the right rear tire of the vehicle, and it was in fact like the tire we were looking for. I then went to my attaché case where I carried a copy of the sketch of the tire with certain important measurements, measured the tire on the right rear of the vehicle, saw some oddities with that particular tire, and made a match.
James Kodadich's vehicle was now linked to the abduction site of 25-year-old Deirdre O'Brien, murdered a few weeks before. The killer's 3rd victim became the investigation's prime suspect. To be absolutely certain that the tires matched, investigators turned again to forensic tire expert Pete McDonald. The tire in question is rolled on what's essentially a giant ink pad, leaving an impression of its entire tread circumference on a length of white cardboard. After completing this process on Kodadich's Chevy, investigators sent a negative transparency of the tire impression found at Deirdre O'Brien's abduction site to Peter McDonald. McDonald then compared that to the suspect's tire impression. After 25 hours of scrutiny, McDonald was absolutely certain he'd found what he was looking for.
I was able to make a positive identification because there were many cuts and tears in the tire that were unique to that tire only.
That proved that Kodadich's car was at the scene. The information was enough for investigators to obtain a warrant. Kodadich was still in the hospital when arrested for suspicion of murdering Deirdre O'Brien. When confronted with the tire impression evidence, the suspect admitted making a sharp turn on that stretch of highway, but not at the time of the murder. Though police did not believe him, the evidence was only circumstantial. Investigators had to find another way to build their case. And not just for the murder of Deirdre O'Brien, but also for the murder of 18-year-old Amy Hoffman. They wouldn't need to go very far. The fibers collected from Kodadich's car interior were compared against those found on both victims.
Victims' evidence, such as fibers from skirts, were actually found in his car, and then carpet fibers from his vehicle and foam from the seat cushion was actually found on the victims. So there was a cross-link.
Certainly can. No problem.
Despite the evidence against him, Kodadich maintained he was not the killer. He pointed to his stab wound as proof. Investigators decided to take a closer look at the injury. The severity and the angle suggested it was self-inflicted.
How many days ago did you get it?
But why did he bother?
We believe that he thought the police might have had an idea or were looking at him as a suspect in the case, which we weren't, but that's why we believed he made this particular scenario up.
But Kodadich's plan backfired and led investigators right to him. Based on the evidence, police believe that Kodadich prowled for vulnerable women to abduct, molest, and kill. For the murders of Amy Hoffman and Deirdre O'Brien, James Kodadich was sentenced to 95 years. Kodadich was difficult to apprehend because his random victims had no connection to him. Most murders aren't random, and the killer goes to great lengths to obliterate the connection between himself and the victim. On May 8, 1993, a young couple at Lake Lou Yeager Park in Illinois frantically summoned the help of the park caretaker. Someone had built a fire in a pile of brush. In the center was what looked like a mannequin. At first, the couple thought it was a prank, but when they looked closer, they realized whoever did this was deadly serious. The body was real. After the body was pulled from the smoldering pile, the police were notified. Police could discern that the victim was female, but that was all. Her head was missing. They retrieved melted trash bags and a charred cardboard carton from the debris. Detective Mike Sheely of the Illinois State Police led the search for more clues.
We brought in Illinois State Police dogs and attempted to search the area for any other possible evidence and the possibility of finding the victim's decapitated head. Those were unsuccessful.
Investigators had no clue who the killer was and no clue to the victim either. They felt confident that the identity of the victim would lead to her killer. This crime was simply too gruesome to be a random attack.
Anyone who would go to all that trouble to try to burn a body and to decapitate them went to a lot of trouble because of the association between the suspect and the victim.
For now, their best clue was the victim herself. X-rays revealed fibroid tumors in her uterus, severe enough to cause medical problems. The plastic bags were ordinary trash bags. The cardboard carton was from a self-service moving company. Neither seemed like much of a clue. A forensic anthropologist was called in to determine all he could from the victim's bones. Determining an approximate age, height, and the victim's race would be crucial to matching her with a missing persons report. Forensic anthropologist Dr. Mark Johnsey of the Illinois State Police Crime Lab made the analysis.
The pubic symphysis, which is down in the pelvic region, is a very good indicator of age. The pelvic bone in this area changes very diagnostically with age, and based on that I could make an assessment of her age, which I gave her an age range of 35 to 39.
Establishing race was more problematic. Flesh tone is distorted in death, and the fire didn't help that. Dr. Johnsey had to rely on his best judgment under difficult circumstances.
Both the pubic hair and the axillary hair in the armpit, which she had both, was very straight. And she was fairly light-skinned, and with the combination of those features, it was just felt that she was a Caucasian.
Now, investigators needed a name. The most certain way of identifying a person is by fingerprints. But that works only if they can be lifted from the victim and if the victim's prints are on file somewhere. Illinois State Police forensic scientist Gary Havey was assigned the task of seeing that this Jane Doe met those requirements. The victim's hands were removed and sent in sealed cans to his lab. They were dry and stiffened in a clutched position. If Havey hoped to raise any prints, he'd have to amputate individual fingers and soften the tissue.
In the case of Jane Doe, in order to soften the tissue, one of the procedures or methods that I have found to be useful over the last years is to actually soak the fingers in a solution of detergent.
The solution softens the tissue on the friction ridges, which are the unique arches, whorls, and loops on every person's fingertips. Once the fingers were softened and dried, Havey rolled them in ink and printed their ridge patterns onto white paper. But he wasn't satisfied.
I didn't want just suitable prints, I wanted the absolute best standard we could achieve. We then decided to utilize a different method in obtaining the friction ridge detail from the fingers and palms. Over the years, I've had good success utilizing black powder and frosted lifting tape.
The powder and tape yielded better results, which were then photographed and labeled. They would then be classified and sent to AFIS, the Automated Fingerprint Identification System in Joliet, Illinois, which holds fingerprint cards for the entire state. Only Jane Doe's left thumb and index fingers were clear enough for the AFIS computer. Usually, that's all it needs.
At this time, there were 1.7 to 1.8 million cards on file in Joliet. It would be totally impossible for me to manually search all of those cards, but with AFIS, we can actually scan those individual cards in a period of 30 minutes upwards to 2 or 3 hours.
The results came back negative. No matches. The victim and her killer remained anonymous. A nameless murder victim was found burning in an Illinois park. Until investigators could determine the identity of the Caucasian woman, her killer would remain free. Desperate for clues, detectives interviewed witnesses who were in the park the night the body was discovered. 2 students, taking a drive after their prom, reported seeing the fire. Nearby was a cargo van. They believed the tags were from Missouri. The back was open, and they could see plastic trash bags. Detectives were convinced the teenagers next saw the killer.
They actually pull alongside the suspect van, and they're quite alarmed that somebody would actually have a fire in this no-burn area. They're familiar with the park, and basically at that point, the suspect sees the car pull alongside, and he immediately runs and jumps into the van and speeds away.
But without a tag number, it was another untraceable lead. To solve this case, investigators had to identify the victim, who they referred to as Jane Doe. They expanded the APHIS fingerprint search.
We performed APHIS searches in over 45 different APHIS systems throughout the United States, Canada, and even Puerto Rico. This would prove to be the most extensive APHIS search ever undertaken by the Illinois State Police.
Millions of prints were scrutinized, and still no leads. The victim apparently had no criminal record and was not on any database. Likewise, hundreds of missing persons reports were scrutinized over a period of more than 18 months. Though none matched the description of a 30-something Caucasian woman whose fingerprints matched Jane Doe's, one name consistently popped up.
The one constant factor that we continued to see was a victim, Lynn Matcham Thomas, from the greater St. Louis area. She had came on our list before, and we had called St. Louis missing persons and also talked to the homicide squad, but we had discounted the fact that this would be our victim because she was African American.
With no other leads, investigators went to speak with Shirley Matcham, the mother of Lynn Matcham Thomas. Like her daughter, she lived in Missouri, only 50 miles from the Illinois park where the victim was found. Shirley had reported Lynn missing the day before the body was found. According to her mother, Lynn had light skin. Like the victim, she also had fibroid tumors that she was seeing a doctor about. In fact, the day she disappeared, her brother had dropped her off at her doctor's office and made arrangements to pick her up afterward. When he returned, he was 10 minutes late. He went inside, but she was no longer there. He assumed that she grew tired of waiting and decided to walk home. He didn't think anything more about it. Later that night, Mrs. Matcham received a call from Lynn's husband, Curtis Thomas, asking where Lynn might be. He said she'd left his house 20 minutes earlier, and he assumed she'd gone to her mother's. But her mother hadn't seen her all day. Shirley Matcham knew her son-in-law to be violent and suspected the worst. The next day, she filed a missing persons report with the St. Louis Police Department. Investigators reviewed the report. They learned that St. Louis police had followed up with a visit to Lynn's home to speak with her husband, Curtis Thomas. He told them that the night Lynn disappeared, she was moving out of the house. He wasn't happy about it, and they fought. The last time he'd seen her, she was walking away from the house. At first, he thought she'd just run off without her things, but when she didn't show up at her mother's, he thought something serious might have happened. Sifting through the report, investigators found another potential clue.
We also found out that when Lynn Matcham Thomas was discovered missing, that the police had went to the Thomas residence and asked for permission to search the house. Mr. Thomas let him in. They conducted a search on the second and first floors, and when the police asked to go to the basement, Mr. Thomas insisted that he call his attorney, and they terminated the search.
With no victim or any signs of foul play, the missing persons investigation in St. Louis ended. But now, almost 2 years later, investigators in Illinois suspected that the body found in the park was Lynn Matcham Thomas. The timing of her disappearance fit. Her medical condition was the same. And her husband, Curtis Thomas, was becoming the prime suspect. Investigators in Illinois struggled to identify a decapitated woman found burning in a state park. Though they believed she was Shirley Matcham Thomas and that her husband Curtis had put her there, they had to prove it. Investigators went back to Lynn's mother for past employment information about her daughter.
And quite to our surprise, she said that her daughter had been employed by a local bank, and during the course of that employment that she had been fingerprinted. So we were able to go to the St. Louis Police Department now and look in a specific file. Those files were not in any database, and manually had to pull those fingerprints to compare them with our Jane Doe.
The comparison was made. Jane Doe was, in fact, Lynn Matcham Thomas. Because of their stormy marriage, their violent history, and the fact that he was the last one to have seen Lynn, Curtis Thomas became the prime suspect. What police needed was proof. Investigators now tried to find a link between evidence left at the crime scene and the suspect. They determined that a cardboard carton pulled from the fire was from the same moving company that the victim was using to pack her belongings. However incriminating, the evidence was only circumstantial. To learn more about Curtis Thomas and his activities following Lynn's disappearance, investigators located an ex-girlfriend who he started seeing after his wife was reported missing. She said that Curtis claimed the police were stupid for misidentifying the race of Jane Doe. This was several weeks before she was identified as African American. She also added that Curtis had access to a van through his work. It matched the description of the van seen at the park the night of the murder. The girlfriend was frightened of Curtis and ended the relationship. That testimony, along with the rest of the circumstantial evidence they gathered, gave investigators enough to arrest Curtis Thomas in January 1995 for suspicion of murdering his wife almost 2 years earlier. A search warrant for his home was issued. Though Thomas insisted he knew nothing about the fate of his estranged wife, investigators found newspaper clippings regarding the mysterious body in Illinois. Police theorize that the abusive Curtis Thomas was unwilling to let his wife simply walk out on him. Investigators believe that after murdering Lynn Matcham Thomas, he kept the body in the basement until he could get the work van. And to throw investigators off his trail, he beheaded the victim, then transported her to the park in Illinois, where he set the remains on fire. Curtis Thomas was found guilty. He was sentenced to life without parole. Thomas tried to erase the connection between himself and the victim. Others try to erase all evidence of the crime itself. On September 14, 1985, a motorist on a secluded highway in Utah pulled over to help a frantic man. David Mosman said his pickup truck went off the road in Logan Canyon and plunged 285 feet to the river below. His wife, Tanya, was still down there. The motorist called for help. Though banged up and visibly shaken, Mosman's injuries were relatively minor. He told emergency workers that his wife was conscious when he'd helped her out of the wreck and onto the shore. He begged them to help her. As David Mosman was transported to the hospital, a rescue team was in the canyon, searching in the dark for his wife. About 40 feet from the overturned vehicle, caught on rocks in the middle of the river, lay Tanya Mosman. She was face down in the water, dead. By the time she was retrieved, David Mosman was in the hospital getting his wounds treated. He told the nurse that he glanced off the road for a second to look at his wife. At that instant, the truck went over. He blamed his carelessness for the accident. Investigators arrived at the hospital. They asked the nurse if David was in any shape to make a statement. She told them that his injuries were minor and he needn't stay there. She said that Mosman told her he'd been thrown from the truck just as it went over the embankment. She considered him lucky to be alive. Investigators waited until the next day to get a detailed account of the accident. When asked about his marriage, David Mosman said that things between him and his wife had been shaky. They were going through a bitter divorce, but lately they were working to save their relationship. That night, he'd taken her to a restaurant. They enjoyed themselves and each other. It was like it used to be before their relationship soured. After dinner, they'd headed home. David Mosman had driven that stretch of road dozens of times before. He said he must have taken his eyes off the road as he approached the curb. He said all he remembered was his wife's screams. Confused and shaken, he made his way to the bottom of the canyon. When he reached Tanya, she was partially ejected from the back of the truck. He helped her out and started back up to get help. Utah Highway Patrol Officer Larry Forsgren worked the accident investigation.
He said he put her on the bank and that she was all right, and he had talked to her and she was fine. He said that she did mention that her head hurt a little bit, but other than that, and he didn't see any blood. She wasn't bleeding. And he put her on the bank so then he'd go up and get help.
Mosman said it took him more than 2 hours to climb up the canyon in the dark. He thought he must have blacked out or fallen asleep in the cold. He didn't know how his wife ended up back in the river. In the days following Tanya Mosman's death, accident reconstruction experts studied the spot where the truck went over. On the pavement was a small scuff mark, showing that the steering wheel was turned abruptly off the road at about 20 to 30 miles per hour. For Cache County Deputy Medical Examiner Sergeant George Becker, that fact presented an inconsistency with David Mosman's account.
At that point, the vehicle would tilt up to go off the road as it's going over the bank. It would have been impossible to get out of the vehicle on the driver's side. You'd have to lift the door straight up and climb out while the vehicle is moving. It's impossible.
The routine analysis of the accident had raised more questions than it answered. For investigators, this case demanded a closer look. Police in Utah continued investigating the tragic death of Tanya Mosman, killed when the truck she and her husband David were driving plunged 285 feet into a canyon. David Mosman's account of the accident didn't jibe with the facts. Investigators requested an autopsy on Tanya Mosman. Water in her lungs showed that her cause of death was drowning. A mark from hip to shoulder suggested she'd been wearing her seatbelt, which would have made it impossible for her to be thrown through the back windshield, as her husband claimed. The only other marks to her body were 3 blunt and distinctive contusions on the back of her head. Looking for answers, the forensics team inspected the truck for what might have caused the marks. They also used chemically treated swabs called hemosticks, which turn blue on contact with traces of blood. No blood was found, and no object in the truck could have caused the victim's contusions. Investigators went back to the scene to gather more information. What they found was a length of sprinkler irrigation pipe entangled on the riverbank. David Mosman, a school teacher, moonlighted as a sprinkler installer. The pipe was sent to Dr. Kent Glanville of the Logan County Police Department Crime Lab for further examination. He placed the pipe over life-sized photographs of the wounds on Tanya's head. The pipe was a perfect fit. But Mosman had a reason to carry it, and, however unlikely, it might have struck the victim during the truck's tumble. With all the inconsistencies and lingering questions, investigators pressed Mosman to try to remember more details of the accident. He was asked to draw a map of the road and to mark where he lost control and went over. He did it with pinpoint accuracy, something most accident victims can't do.
He was exactly sure that this is where he went off, and it was close to the approximate same area that the vehicle went off. And that was kind of odd because when he went off, it was nighttime, it was dark. And for him to pinpoint it, he had to be pretty familiar with that location. And I got the impression that he knew beforehand where that vehicle was going to go off.
Things that I just don't think anything about.
2 days after the accident, that impression was reinforced when a friend of David Mosman's named Terry contacted police.
She's so easy to slip something in a drink or...
He said the couple had a difficult marriage and that David was always joking about how he was going to kill Tanya. Chief Prosecutor Jim Jenkins followed the investigation.
David told Terry that he didn't want to go through the expense of a divorce. He didn't want to risk losing custody of the two children. And he didn't want to give any of the property or finances that he had accumulated.
Now trying to prove that David Mosman had murdered his wife, police began interviewing Tanya's friends. They were well aware of the Mosmans' disintegrating marriage. One friend said that Tanya was often terrified of David. Sometimes he was violent. Mostly they fought over the custody of their two young children. She told investigators that David had recently tried to make Tanya sign a document he'd written, forcing her to relinquish custody of their kids if they divorced. He'd even threatened to kill her if she didn't sign it. Even so, Tanya sought legal advice about getting a divorce. Shortly after that, David began acting very nicely to her. Tanya told her friend that she was looking forward to dinner with her husband. She sincerely believed that on the night she died, they would reconcile. It all seemed tragically convenient for David Mosman, so investigators continued to dig. They discovered that David had had a $10,000 life insurance policy on his wife for many years. But 9 months before her death, while their marriage was crumbling, he took out additional policies for an additional $100,000. A motive was firmly established, and the circumstances of Tanya's death were suspicious. Still, it could have been an improbable accident. Investigators had to prove that it wasn't. David Mosman said he left his injured wife on the riverbank, but she was found in the middle of the river. Investigators hired hydrological engineer Dr. Dave Tullis to see if that was possible.
The deputy wanted me to assess the situation and see if there was any reasonable way that she could have gone from the riverbank, where he said he left her, to the location in the river in the condition that she was in.
Dr. Tullis measured the river's depth, velocity, and direction of the current to calculate if an object as large as a human body could be carried from the bank and deposited at the spot where the victim was found. He determined that the shallow water near the bank couldn't support a body, and even if it could, the speed and direction of the current would carry it along the edge, not to the middle of the river.
If she was unconscious, she couldn't move, and the current would not have been able to move her along, and so she would have been found right by the riverbank in the unconscious condition or drowned condition.
But she wasn't. She had never been taken to the bank of the river, as her husband had said. David Mosman was arrested for suspicion of murdering his wife. Investigators believe that David Mosman tried to kill Tanya in the premeditated crash. But when she survived, he had to climb down the canyon and finish the job. The motive, apparently, was hatred of his wife, custody of his children, and $110,000 in insurance. For his crimes, David Mosman was sentenced to life in prison. Prisons are filled with people who thought they'd committed the perfect crime. But a murder isn't over once the victim is dead. For investigators, that's just the beginning. They turn to forensic scientists to help bring justice to the victims by exposing a killer's fatal error.